Welcome to Time in Tune. This is where music meets memory and every note tells a story. When I went to Austria, I visited the Queen's Palace, Schönbrunn. Among the gilded mirrors, sweeping staircases, and hushed reverence of the past, I discovered a story that gripped me far more than I expected, the story of Empress Elisabeth of Austria. Known affectionately and sometimes tragically as Sisi. She was more than just a face on coins or portraits. Sisi was a woman misunderstood, romanticized, and ultimately crushed by the expectations of an empire. Her life reads like a fairy tale gone awry, a glittering crown masking invisible chains. Elizabeth Amalie Eugenie, affectionately called Sisi, was born on Christmas Eve, 24 December 1837, in a cozy corner room of the Herzog Max Palais in Munich. She was the third child and second daughter of Duke Maximilian Joseph in Bavaria and Princess Ludovica, part of the sprawling Wittelsbach dynasty. Unlike most princesses, Elizabeth didn't grow up in strict courtly confines. Winters were spent in Munich's townhouse, while summers were joyfully passed at Possenhofen Castle, perched beside Lake Starnberg, a picturesque retreat of forests, meadows, and horses. Her world was one of freedom, not framed by etiquette, but by fresh air, sunlight, and informal days. She rode horseback across the countryside, skipped formal lessons to roam the woods, and felt most alive by the lake's edge. Growing up in a warm bohemian household, her father, Duke Maximilian, was something of a free spirit, eccentric, financially independent, sometimes absent but always adventurous. Her mother, Ludovica, though royal and more traditional, tolerated this unconventional upbringing. Often described as dreamy, spirited, and sensitive, young Elizabeth had an air of quiet rebellion. She composed poetry full of longing and introspection, a rare habit for a princess her age, hinting at the melancholy that would permeate her later years. In one contemporaneous account, her childhood was likened to that of a poor bird that had left the home nest before it had learned to fly, symbolizing how unprepared she was for the rigid life awaiting her at the Habsburg court. In the summer of 1853, Sisi was just 15 years old when she traveled to Bad Ischl, a quiet spa town nestled in the Austrian Alps. The journey was meant to be a formal introduction. Her older sister Helen, the poised and proper one, had been carefully groomed by their mother to marry Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. Sisi was merely tagging along. Awkward, shy, and completely unprepared, she wore a simple dress and tied her hair in braids. She wasn't thinking of marriage, certainly not of becoming empress of one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. She was, at heart, still a carefree Bavarian girl who loved riding horses and writing poetry, but fate had other plans. The moment Franz Joseph laid eyes on Elizabeth, something changed. He was captivated, not by the bride his mother had chosen, but by Sisi's youthful beauty, her vulnerability, and her quiet grace. He broke royal protocol by insisting he would marry Elizabeth and no one else. It caused scandal and disappointment at court, especially for Helene. But the emperor would not be swayed. And just like that, Sisi was chosen. She didn't feel honored. She felt trapped. She wept when she was told the news. Letters and diary entries from the time reveal a young girl terrified of the role being forced upon her. She wrote of sleepless nights and a deep unease. Unlike most girls of her time who dreamed of crowns and castles, Sisi recoiled from the idea of a gilded life under constant scrutiny. And yet, less than a year later, on April 24, 1854, Sisi was crowned Empress of Austria in a grand Viennese wedding seen by millions across the empire. But her heart was not in the ceremony. From the very beginning, she felt like a bird in a cage, adorned, admired, and confined. Her world changed overnight. No longer free to roam, no longer able to write or think in private, she was consumed by court etiquette, politics, and the ever-watchful eyes of the Habsburg elite. This was not a fairy tale. This was a sacrifice. Court life for Elizabeth, now Empress of Austria, was not the dream many imagined. It was rigid, ritualized, and cold, frozen in formality and ruled by duty rather than warmth. From the moment she entered the Hofburg, its towering stone walls seemed to close in around her like a gilded prison. She had grown up in the fresh, untamed beauty of Passenhofen, surrounded by nature, freedom, and laughter. But Vienna was another world entirely. One of rules, silence, and surveillance. The palace loomed with intimidating grandeur, high arched ceilings, vast corridors, heavy drapes, and the hollow echo of footsteps that never felt her own. Every step she took was choreographed. Every word she spoke was measured. Even the chandelier seemed to observe her, cold and unblinking. She was just 16, but the crown on her head erased her girlhood overnight. And behind the velvet curtains of the imperial palace stood Archduchess Sophie, her formidable mother-in-law, the true power behind the throne. Sophie didn't welcome her like a daughter, she sized her up like a servant. From the very beginning, she made it clear. Elizabeth might wear the title of empress, but she would not hold the reins of her own life. Sophie dictated everything, what Sisi wore, how she spoke, how she behaved, even how she mothered. Her children were taken from her immediately after birth, raised according to court protocol, not maternal instinct. Sisi's opinions were dismissed, her emotions considered inconvenient. She was young, beautiful, and silenced. That first night in the Hofburg, after the fanfare had faded, Elizabeth sat alone in her vast, unfamiliar chambers. The walls were rich with tapestries and history, but she felt small, misplaced, an ornament in a world of marble and mirrors. As she crawled into the grand imperial bed, beneath layers of satin and embroidered linens, the weight of her new reality crushed her. She wept, not just from exhaustion, but from the quiet terror of knowing she would never again belong to herself. She longed for the lake, for the woods of Passenhofen, for her father's gentle voice and the freedom to laugh without restraint. But all of that had been left behind with her childhood. Here, there was no room for innocence. When she learned she was pregnant with her first child, she was filled with wonder. She was still little more than a child herself, barely 17, but the news filled her with a sense of purpose that had long felt absent. In a life where nothing belonged to her, the child growing inside her felt deeply, intimately hers. She dreamed of cradling her baby, of reading stories, of creating the kind of warm, nurturing bond she had known in Passenhofen. For the first time since stepping into the palace, Elizabeth felt joy that no court ceremony could steal. She imagined freedom in motherhood, believing, perhaps naively, that it might soften the walls around her, give her a place of belonging again. But that joy was short-lived. When her daughter, Sophie, died suddenly of illness while traveling through Hungary, Elizabeth was shattered. She was barely 18. The loss broke something in her, and instead of comfort, the court offered her rebuke. Her grief was seen as weakness, her sorrow an overreaction. She was told to move on, for duty, for image, for empire. But she didn't move on. Instead, she turned inward. If she couldn't control her world, she would control herself. Her body became her battleground. She starved it, disciplined it, measured it with near religious rigor. Her waist shrank to 19 inches. She weighed herself every morning. She fasted for days, consumed little more than broth or fruit. Hours were spent having her floor-length hair brushed, wrapped, coiled, and pinned. She walked for miles, fenced, rode horses like a soldier, always in pursuit of the next moment of escape. To many, these were signs of vanity, but they misunderstood her. This was not obsession for admiration, it was survival through ritual. In a palace where she had no voice, her body became her only domain, her only rebellion. And so, behind the portraits of the dazzling empress, beneath the diamonds and silk, was a woman aching to be free. A woman who did not wish to be worshipped, but to be seen, to be known, to be allowed to grieve, to mother, to live, not as an empress, but as Elizabeth. As years passed, Sisi began to flee, not just from Vienna, but from the suffocating court, the expectations, the loneliness that had wrapped itself around her like the corsets she once cinched so tightly. She wandered across Europe, her carriages rolling down unfamiliar roads, her identity often hidden beneath veils or false names. In these journeys, she wasn't an empress. She was a woman trying to outrun sorrow. Hungary became her refuge, a second home that gave her what Vienna never could: freedom and a sense of dignity. There, she was not just tolerated, but admired. She embraced the Hungarian language, the customs, the people. Her bond with Count Gyula Andrassy only deepened her affection for the land. In Hungary, she felt like herself again, respected, valued, even beloved. And then there was Gyula. Count Gyula Andrassy, the charismatic Hungarian statesman, was more than a political ally. He was elegant, fiercely intelligent, and known as the most handsome man in Hungary. Their correspondence was tender and often veiled in poetic affection. Andrassy adored Elisabeth, not just as an empress, but as a woman. She, in turn, trusted him as few others. Their bond was intimate, layered with respect, and laced with emotion. Rumors swirled. Some whispered that theirs was an affair of the heart, and perhaps the body too. It was said that Andrassy once confessed his love for her and even proposed marriage. Had she not already been the wife of an emperor? There was gossip that her youngest daughter, Marie Valerie, may have even been his, though history offers no proof. Still, the speculation endured, fed by the undeniable tenderness in their letters and the way they looked at each other in rare, captured moments. Whether it was ever consummated or not, what existed between Sisi and Gyula was real, a kind of soul connection. In him, she found a man who saw her not as a symbol, but as a person, who listened, who defended her, who chose her, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Their relationship was a sanctuary in a world that often felt like a cage. But it wasn't just personal, it was political. Sisi's love for Hungary and her bond with Count Andrassy would help shape the future of an empire. By the mid-1860s, the Austrian Empire was strained. Crushed militarily by Prussia, weakened politically, and deeply divided, especially with the Hungarians who had long sought greater autonomy. The old order was crumbling. Franz Joseph, conservative and rigid, struggled to hold it together. But Elisabeth saw something different. She had come to understand and respect the Hungarian people, not as rebels, but as patriots. And they, in turn, adored her. She wasn't the cold symbol of the monarchy. She was warm, engaged, and present. Fluent in their language, attuned to their struggles, Andrassy, who had once been exiled for his role in the Hungarian Revolution of 1848, was now emerging as a key figure in negotiations for reconciliation. Sisi became his quiet but powerful ally. She urged Franz Joseph to make peace. She appealed to his logic, his heart, even his pride, and she succeeded. In part because he loved her, and in part because her support lent credibility to the cause. The result was historic, the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867. The empire was transformed into a dual monarchy, Austria-Hungary. Hungary was granted its own parliament and considerable autonomy while remaining united with Austria under Franz Joseph. It was a political victory, but it was also a personal one. That same year, on June 8, 1867, Elizabeth and Franz Joseph were crowned King and Queen of Hungary in a grand ceremony at Matthias Church in Buda. The people rejoiced, they wept. They showered her with flowers and called her Erzsébet, our queen. Sisi wore a crown not just of state, but of love. For once, she wasn't merely a symbol. She was a bridge, a peacemaker, a sovereign queen in her own right. And Hungary, more than any palace in Vienna, felt like home. In 1889, her world shattered once more. Her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was found dead in a remote hunting lodge at Mayerling alongside his young mistress. A murder-suicide cloaked in scandal and imperial secrecy. Rudolf had been her pride, her confidant, her last great hope. His death was not only the loss of a son, it was the collapse of everything she had endured to protect. Her grief was bottomless. From that day forward, Sisi changed. She wore only black, not as a statement but as a shield. She refused portraits, avoided mirrors, and covered her face with a fan or a veil. Even her famous beauty became a ghost of the past, deliberately hidden, deliberately forgotten. She no longer fled only from the court. Now, she fled from herself, from memory, from pain. And though she continued to travel restlessly, endlessly, there was no place left that could bring her peace. Because when Rudolf died, a part of Sisi died too. Few people truly understood how brilliant Sisi was. Beneath the diamonds and silks, beyond the romantic image of a beautiful empress, lived a woman of immense intelligence, curiosity, and longing. She was not content to be ornamental. She was a seeker of knowledge, of truth, of freedom. From a young age, Elisabeth displayed a sharp and questioning mind. She became fluent in Hungarian and modern Greek, mastering both to a scholarly level. Hungarian, the language of a proud and oppressed people, became her bridge to a country that would later embrace her as their queen. Greek opened the doors to ancient philosophy and poetry, worlds far removed from the suffocating rituals of court. While others at the Hofburg Palace obsessed over fashion, etiquette, and influence, Sisi devoured the works of Homer and Heinrich Heine. She found solace in their verses, tales of heroism, tragedy, and existential yearning that mirrored her own inner life. She wrote her own poetry, often dark and melancholic, revealing a woman at odds with her public image. These verses weren't meant to charm the court. They were an act of survival, a way to process her pain. I flee from joy, I flee from pain. These were not idle musings. They were cries from a soul burdened by expectations she never asked for. Sisi wasn't interested in court gossip or courtly games. While the salons buzzed with ambition, who wore the finest jewels, who gained favor with Archduchess Sophie, who whispered what to whom, Sisi retreated. She would walk the palace gardens alone, sometimes for hours, lost in thought or absorbed in a book. She had little patience for the endless protocols that governed imperial life. The scheduled meals, the choreographed appearances, the forced smiles. She detested the daily performances that court life demanded. Unlike the other women of the palace, she refused to compete for power or attention. She rarely attended court functions unless absolutely required, and when she did, she made her disinterest plain. Her aloofness was not rudeness, it was resistance. She refused to conform to the mold that had been created for her. According to rumor, though never officially confirmed, she even had a tattoo of Achilles on her shoulder, the Greek hero whose tragic fate she felt deeply connected to. Whether the tattoo existed or not, the symbolism spoke volumes. Achilles, like Sisi, was both admired and doomed, immortalized and isolated. For a royal woman in the 19th century to mark her body so boldly, even in private, would have been a radical act, a declaration of ownership over the one thing she could still control, herself. Sisi did not want power. She did not crave influence or authority. Unlike many empresses who played political games behind the scenes, Elisabeth had no interest in manipulating ministers or guiding policy. Her rebellion was quieter, but no less revolutionary. She resisted simply by refusing to become what they wanted her to be. Instead, she turned inward. She became her own domain. She fasted, exercised obsessively, and adhered to a strict beauty regimen, not for vanity, but for discipline, control, and escape. Her life became a series of rituals to carve out space for herself in a world that gave her none. The court saw her as difficult, as distant, as cold. But in truth, Sisi was protecting something fragile and sacred, her independence. In the palace corridors, where courtiers jostled for rank and reputation, Sisi was an enigma, a myth in motion, a woman who seemed to float just beyond reach, an outsider by choice. She didn't gossip, didn't flatter, didn't bend to custom. She wasn't just a tragic figure in a tiara. She was a philosopher in a corset, a poet in exile, and a woman unwilling to be tamed. By 1898, Empress Elisabeth of Austria, Sisi, was no longer the adored rose of the imperial court. She had become a phantom in perpetual exile, wandering Europe under false titles, cloaked always in mourning black, her beauty dimmed, her spirit hollowed by grief. That September, she arrived in Geneva, seeking anonymity, not admiration, not duty, not even rest, just escape. She traveled under the name Countess of Hohenems, a borrowed identity to shield her from a world that had only ever demanded something from her. She carried no jewels, no entourage, no guards, just her lady-in-waiting, a black parasol, and decades of sorrow. Sisi was tired, not simply from age, but from a lifetime of surviving in a world that had never allowed her to simply live. Her son Rudolf was gone, her marriage hollow, her palace a gilded cage long abandoned. She had spent decades running from protocol, from pain, from the weight of being seen and never understood. That morning, as she strolled along the Geneva waterfront, her mind was far away, perhaps with Rudolf or with the poetry she scribbled in her diary. She was still grieving, still haunted, but calm. And then it happened. In a flash, a man lunged at her. He bumped into her chest as if by accident. She staggered but regained her composure. No one screamed. No one noticed. Sisi herself didn't know she had been stabbed. She continued walking toward the steamship. Only moments later, she collapsed. Her lady-in-waiting thought it was a fainting spell, but beneath her corset, blood bloomed across her chemise. The weapon, a sharpened file, had slipped between her ribs, piercing her heart. She died shortly after, in a modest hotel room, with none of the grandeur that had marked her title. And so, the life of Elizabeth ended in silence. Not in a palace, not before a throne, but beside a lake, alone, anonymous, a queen with no crown, a woman with no country. She was 60 years old, a mother without her child, a seeker who never found home. A woman whose mind soared even as her body wandered. But where was Franz Joseph in all of this? He was still emperor, still a man bound by the machine of empire. He loved Sisi, but he didn't understand her. From the beginning, Franz Joseph saw in Elizabeth the ideal empress, graceful, beautiful, untouchable. But he could not reach the woman underneath. He admired her from a distance but never learned how to walk beside her. He built her retreats, wrote tender letters, tried in the only ways he knew to give her space. But he did not stop his mother, Archduchess Sophie, from controlling her life, from taking her children, from suffocating her voice. He didn't ask what Sisi needed. He didn't challenge the traditions that caged her. He let her drift until she disappeared altogether. Was he cruel? No. But he was distant, bound by duty, and too rooted in empire to follow a woman who longed for freedom more than power. When news of her death reached him, he wept, truly, deeply. Not just for his wife, but for all that was lost between them. He ordered her rooms sealed, her belongings untouched. He mourned her the rest of his life, not only the empress, but the woman he never truly knew. Sisi was more than a tragic figure, more than a silhouette in star-pinned hair. And when she died, quietly, anonymously, with no crown upon her head, it was the closing of a soul who had spent her life searching for a place to simply be. Like Princess Diana a century later, Sisi was adored by the public, but lonely behind palace walls. Both women were icons of beauty, yet burdened by scrutiny. Both tried to break free from the cages of royalty. Both died far from home, not as sovereigns in splendor, but as wounded women trying to reclaim their lives. Their stories echo across time, reminders that even the most admired women in the world can feel invisible, unheard, and ultimately alone. But in their defiance, their longing, and their vulnerability, they became more than empress or princess. They became symbols of what it means to be seen, too much, and yet never enough. And in the end, it was not their crowns that defined them, but their courage to be human. Sisi became more than a queen. She became a legend, a tragic icon, a restless spirit, a symbol of silent rebellion against a world that tried to contain her. But behind the myth stood a real woman, brilliant, wounded, and endlessly misunderstood. She left behind more than diamonds and portraits. She left behind questions, poetry, and a legacy shaped by loss. Her children were scattered by the winds of history, each touched by the same shadows that followed her. Her firstborn, Archduchess Sophie, died in infancy while traveling with Sisi, an unbearable grief that scarred the young empress forever. Her second daughter, Gisela, survived the weight of the Habsburg name. She married into the Bavarian royal family, living a quieter life, distant from her mother's sorrow. Her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was Sisi's pride and heartbreak. Sensitive, intelligent, and deeply tormented, he felt the same chains of duty that once bound his mother. In 1889, he died in a tragic murder-suicide pact at Mayerling, an event that shattered Elizabeth and pushed her further into mourning and isolation. With his death, the future of the empire trembled. And then there was her youngest, Marie Valerie, often called the Hungarian child. She was the only one Sisi truly raised herself, born after her deep bond with Hungary had taken root. Sisi poured all her maternal love into Valerie, perhaps to heal the wounds left by the children taken from her earlier. Valerie married and had children of her own, carrying on the Habsburg line with quiet dignity. As for Franz Joseph, he reigned for 68 years, outliving Sisi by 18. When he died in 1916, the world was already at war, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire stood at the brink of collapse. The dynasty they built faded. The palaces turned into museums, the crowns into relics. But the story of Sisi endured, not because of the empire she ruled, but because of the soul she revealed. She remains a figure of fascination, her image etched into marble and film, her poetry rediscovered, her pain finally recognized. Sisi was no fairy tale empress. She was a woman of contradictions, grace and grief, silence and rebellion, beauty and burden. And though the world once misunderstood her, history now leans closer, listening to the whispers she left behind. If stories of resilience, longing, and legacy move you, please like, share, and subscribe.